Okay, it's over to you then, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I mean, I think I've been introduced to a lot of you before, but for those who are watching the recording later, my name's Pete Seymour. I'm a plant health consultant specializing more in entomology within horticulture. So I'm going to be talking today about identification and management of weevils in soft fruit. So we're going to be sort of running through a number of things about weevil biology and life cycle, things to watch out for, and potential biological and chemical options, and what the kind of state of play is at the moment and where the lay of the land is. As Chris mentioned, we're trying to cover a lot. It's a lot of information in a short amount of time that can be very in-depth or very sort of generic, and trying to tailor that to everybody is quite tricky. So do bear with me, and if you do have any questions, I've got a couple of sections built into this where we will be able to talk about any questions people have about what's been discussed, or if people like yourselves have any comments or tips for other growers that you've found that's been beneficial for you. It's a good way of getting some conversation going between the different groups there. So with weevils, we're going to be covering the main weevil species that you find in soft fruit. These are the ones that typically appear and that our consultants see on a number of occasions. And quite often they can be very localized, some sites having a bad history for them and having quite large issues, and other sites not really seeing them as much at all. But best to not be complacent with them, because if you just assume that they're never a problem at your site, they'll build slowly up and become more of an issue. So we're going to be covering the vine weevil, Radiorankus sulcatus, and a good rule of thumb with this weevil is that it's a dark brown or a black color with these little orange hair tufts on the wing case, just there, and about 8 to 11 mil long. It's not too large. You've got the clay-covered weevil even, which is a little bit smaller, but is a darker brown, kind of mottled brown, doesn't have those orange tufts, and are a little bit smaller. And then you've got the strawberry blossom weevil, which is very distinctive compared to the other two, because it's 2 to 4 mil long, very, very small. And it's got a very, very long nose or snout that makes it stand out from the other two quite heavily. So we're going to run through a bit of those with sort of different sections for questions, and also a couple of particularly rare weevils that I've never actually seen before, but I was having a conversation with another of our consultants. So we'll just give you a quick run over of those, just in case you happen to be one of the sites that might actually see these pests. Okay, so we're looking at vine weevil to start with. So they are a weevil pest that exists in most, to be honest, most soft fruit and hardy nursery stock kind of crops. They are very prevalent across a lot of the UK. Hell, if I go around my housing estate that I live on, which has got a lot of plants that they brought in from garden centres, I see notching all over the place. So they are quite prevalent. And there's a number of reasons why they're an effective pest. So you've got adults damaging, the adults will damage the leaves. They'll create these little notches that was just on the video. I've got a few more images later. And they then lay eggs in the soil or growing media. These then hatch into the larvae, as you can see in the video at the moment. The larvae then damage the root networks by feeding on the roots, and they then build up on those until they then pupate and emerge as adults, typically around springtime. Now, another reason why they're quite effective pests, if you don't know what the notching is, they are very elusive. They're mostly active at night, so you're not going to see them wandering around the crop during the daytime. They are very, very hard to find. Also with these weevils, they're all female. So there are no males. They reproduce parthenogenetically, which is a mouthful and a half, but essentially means they reproduce asexually. Now that just means they only need the females and they only need one. So all it takes is one weevil to be brought into nursery areas and sites, and then over time they will slowly build up. They're not going to build up suddenly overnight and be an instant issue, but over time they can really become prevalent on a site, if not dealt with. Now, an adult female can lay up to 300 eggs. I've seen lots of numbers bandied about the total number of eggs that they can lay over their lifetime. But from what I've found, it's typically 300 under optimum conditions, but they don't need a male. So there's no sort of mate foraging or searching behavior. So they can really just start laying eggs very, very quickly. And that's the main reason why they're so widespread. Now, rough kind of size marks. The adults are about 7 to 11 mil, so around a centimeter, give or take. And the larvae are around 8 to 10 mil in length when fully grown. I've seen adults that are only about 4 or 5 mil, but they're a lot more uncommon. Typically, they will be closer to that larger size. And very, very early instar larvae that have just hatched are a couple of mil long. So later on in the season, when they're a little bit larger, you're more likely to find them. But early on, you might struggle to just see them directly in the compost. Now, life cycle, again, with the aphids, I didn't go into a great deal of detail because it's a bit too much. However, it's a good way of noting what the key ways are to break the life cycle of these pests and how to counter them year on year. Now, vine weevil only have one generation per year normally, unless it's very sort of high temperatures, and there have been reports of 2. But the females will lay eggs in the growing media, and then the larvae will the eggs will hatch into the larvae, and then they'll feed. Now that kind of continues with the larvae overwintering, and you get some overwintering adults as well. What it means, though, is if you can break the cycle of them hatching and producing larvae and producing eggs, then you have a really solid chance of keeping them under wraps. But if you just leave them to their own devices, then year over year, they will steadily build up and become a much bigger problem. But if you can be a block or put a block in there somewhere to really disrupt them, then you've got a good chance of them not actually being a huge issue for you if you can do it all well. Now, I mentioned that they're very elusive and that you're going to struggle to find them during the daytime. That is completely true. A good visual indicator is notching, which you can see on these sort of images here. Now, this is where the adults are just feeding on the edge of the leaf going inwards. You won't typically find holes in the leaves and things like that. They more than often just feed from the outside going in, and it can lead to some very distinctive notching. I didn't bombard you with thousands of images in this presentation, but if you have a Google of vine weevil notching, you'll get lots of images as good examples in a variety of different crops as well. Now that's the main way that I typically are able to see them. But if you've got issues with vine weevil larvae, then it can be a good indicator that you've got plant wilt or low growth compared to other plants. If you've got other plants that are shooting up, but a few of them are really sort of held back and starved, then that could be an indicator of vine weevil as well. If you're feeling particularly keen, as Chris would say, then you could go out at night. You could go out at night and monitor them. If you go out after dusk, between dusk and 1 a.m., if you wanted, then you would probably be able to see them. And I do know one grower, an organic grower, that actually goes out and plant taps at night to get the best idea of how many he's got. But that will be very situational as to whether it's worth your time or whether you're willing to go out at night. There are other ways of monitoring for them as well, and just generally keeping an eye out for them. You can also get traps from a variety of companies. There's all sorts of shapes and sizes, but the idea behind them is that they are essentially a confined small space that the vine weevil will want to go in and hide in, and then shelter in during the day. And during the day, you can then go along, pop the lid off, and count the number of larvae, the adults that you're seeing inside. They are going to be more effective in places where you don't have abundance of habitat. So if there's lots of leaf litter and other things like that that the vine weevil are going to be sheltering during the day, then the traps probably aren't going to do as much. So it's just something to balance when you're considering your monitoring. There are even lure and kill options. So traps that have sort of bioinsecticides or even nematodes that when they go in, they then catch these. Unfortunately, generally from what I've been reading, they're not particularly cost effective at a commercial scale unless there's been some new developments that I'm not aware of. And as a result, they're more for the home gardener sort of end of things that have got a few vine weevil kicking about. So when you're looking at options for vine weevil control, typically one of the best ones that most of the ADAS consultants recommend is nematodes. So they're a really solid option. There are a few sort of considerations that you need to be using with them, same with any biological control. But essentially the nematodes enter the vine weevil larvae in the soil. They're not really for the adults so much. And then they cause death by septicemia. Which is not particularly a nice way to go. But the nematodes then build up in the larvae, and then the larvae will burst and the nematodes then enter the environment once again. So you can end up with a very sort of sustained method of control with these. There are also options with MET52, which is a granular insecticide. From what I've sort of experiences that I've been told about, typically the conditions for using MET52 need to be very specific and they need to be followed very, very well in order to get control. So I would be very careful with using it and making sure that you follow everything correctly, and consulting basis trained agronomists just to make sure that you're using it as best as possible in order to get the best control. Generally with vine weevil, chemical options, unfortunately, there's no real luck at this point in time. There used to be Exemptor, which was thiacloprid based, but that wasn't typically used in protected edibles anyway. It was more for H&S. So most people have been using nematodes for a long period of time now, and they get really solid results if they use them well. And now I'm going to move on to a few sort of little tips. Chris, as always, do feel free to chime in if you've got any thoughts or comments as I'm going through.
Yeah, I think it's become the standard treatment now for vine weevil in ornamentals and in fruit. So it's been very, very successful. And I think the actual quality of the nematodes that we get now are way better than when they first started. And you can be more or less guaranteed that whatever's in that pouch are alive.
Yeah. So nematodes, I'm going to go into a little bit more information with using these correctly. As Chris said, they're typically one of the sort of staples for dealing with vine weevil now. And if you've never used them, just a quick sort of run through, it'll typically come as a packet like this or in a box. You then place it in water, aerate it, get it moving and agitated, and then you can apply it by either drenching or you can even do it by trickle irrigation. Now, the nematodes work functionally by using moisture in the growing media to move short distances. So you want to get a nice even application because they're not going to move from one end of the bag to the other so well, or sort of longer distances than that even. But if used well and using a few sort of extra tips here, then they can be very, very solid. Now, I would be very careful with following the packet advice and using them very within the sort of time frame that they're given. Also keep them agitated. The lower picture here, which just looks like a bucket of muddy water, is actually us using aquarium aerators, essentially a little air pump to aerate the nematodes. This is because we're doing small scale applications. You may have agitators and stuff like that for larger scale use, but if you don't keep them agitated, they will just settle to the bottom of the can. Okay. And at that point, you're then pouring in or trickling in or anything like that, just water, and then other ends are getting all of the nematodes. Okay, so you need to make sure it's kept agitated. Typically when applying them, I know a lot of people often apply end of August, early September sort of timing. If you've got really bad infestations, my colleague Janet was saying that she recommends using 2 applications at full rate, but that's in really bad sort of hit areas. But there is also another option that was explored within Hardy Nursery stock, which is coined as a little and often approach. So using many applications over a longer period of time at about half rate, that kind of area. And the idea behind that is because nematodes persist pretty well if there's vine weevil around, if you do little and often, then they'll steadily build up a solid population and be present over a longer period of time, allowing you to get a really solid amount of control whilst also being very cost effective. There is a full report available from the HDB, which is HNS 195, that goes into a lot of detail, and we could consolidate some of that and send that around if there is interest there. But it can be very cost effective in reducing sort of labor costs and nematode costs of just doing one large application. So if there's interest in that, then we can explore that a little bit more within the group.
And you can run them through a dosatron. They say take the filters out, but that's perfectly acceptable to run them through the dosatron. But you, like Pete says, you want to wet the bag up first. Yeah. And then put the dosatron feed into the mixture of nematodes and keep stirring it, and while until the dosatron sucked it all up and put it into the crop, and then water a bit after so they can swim into the bags.
Yeah, if you keep the growing media nice and moist for the early stages of the sort of application, then you'll get much better results from it. If you're applying to if you're just straight applying into dry growing media, then the nematodes can die out very quickly. And another piece of advice that turns up on the packets quite a lot, and it is very important, is to not apply in the heat of the day. So you want to be applying it sort of earlier in the day or later on in the evening, because the UV can cause problems for these nematodes. Okay, just for the initial application, obviously. Okay. There are a few passive methods of dealing with vine weevil and other weevils in general, to be honest. I harped on about this in the aphid presentation as well. Good rule of thumb, clean site, happy life. But just it keeps coming up, and it will probably keep being a staple within pest presentations. But if you can keep weed levels low and not an issue on your sites, then it will make things easier for dealing with pests. Because pests will use them as a source of habitat while your plants are smaller. They'll use them as staging grounds to come in. So in very general terms, if you can keep weed levels low, then you're looking better off at dealing with pest numbers overall. Vine weevil themselves also inhabit plant debris. So leaf matter that may have been pulled off the plants and left underneath, that would be more of an issue for soil grown crops as opposed to sort of containerized or tabletop crops. But if you can remove plant debris as much as possible, obviously sometimes that's not realistic, but you will sort of see that there is a general loss of habitat for weevils to be hiding. So it can be very helpful. And another top tip is to check new plants as they're coming in. So check around the roots for any vine weevil larvae. Check around the sort of lips of crates and boxes and things like that, because adults may be hiding around there. So just any of those sort of areas, just keeping an eye out for them. If you know where they're likely to be, then you've got a better chance of spotting them as and when they might come in.
I think in hardy ornamentals, you can also have plants that are very good bait sort of plants. If you're looking at hardy nursery stock nursery, you would look in things like primulas, any type of cyclamen, epimediums. There's sort of weevil favourites, and then you go into that block of the crop and you can see the notches on the leaves. The other thing to do is investigate if you've got strawberries, for example. If any of the strawberries start to fail, then you've got to go through the basic thing of checking for weevil, checking the roots. But you'll see the sort of orange coloured, the chewings where they've been chewing away at the crown, and you can realise then that you've got them. But if you're looking in conifers in hardy nursery stock, by the time you see the damage, the conifer's probably already dead. Yeah.
And sometimes if you go to investigate a plant that looks like it's failed, and you pull it up, if it slides completely out and there's very little root remaining, then that's a solid indicator, because the vine weevil larvae may have just chewed through it. Okay, so we're going to move on to clay-coloured weevils. At the end of this section, there will be a chance for us to sort of discuss clay and vine weevils. I didn't want to do a question section immediately, because there are a lot of similarities between the two, as well as some differences, and differences in the way that you would handle sort of keeping an eye out for them. So clay-coloured weevils, they look quite similar to the casual eye. They cause similar notching to leaves, and they are also nocturnal. I've had some personal accounts of them emerging in higher numbers in a shorter period of time, and they can cause quite a large amount of damage. It was actually clay-coloured weevils that was the example of the organic grower I know that goes out tapping, because they've come out in such high numbers for him that he's found it useful to send staff out after dusk and just plant tap to remove quite large numbers of these weevils, but they are catching huge numbers, which can be very damaging. So if you've only got small numbers, it's probably not going to be worth your time. So we've sort of looked at the sort of issues with, or the aspects of where they're very similar. So key sort of areas where they're different, I mean, they're slightly smaller, but we're talking a few millimeters, so that's not a particularly great way of telling the difference. I know in the aphid presentation, I was talking about color's not a great indicator. Turns out with weevils, it's actually a fairly good indicator, so it's okay to use it here. Now, clay-covered weevils are generally less widespread. They tend to be a bit more localized, even more so than vine weevil, where they're a little bit spread everywhere and you can find them. But some sites will have an issue with them. Others may not have ever seen them. So it does depend on what sort of is going on in your area, but it's something just to be aware of, that there is a different species. But luckily, the main sort of methods of control for these are very similar. They react to nematodes and can be used and can be dealt with as such. So although they are two different species, the kind of grouped together in a large amount of the damage that they do is very similar. And the way of dealing with them is also currently very similar. Now, I know in raspberry crops, they also the larvae tend to feed a little bit deeper and can be found at deeper depths. Now, it's probably not going to make a great deal of difference for you guys when you're monitoring for them, because you'll just be checking the pot anyway, or checking the plant. But it's just worth bearing in mind that they might be a little bit deeper than you expect. Vine weevil quite often sit around the main root ball, whereas the clay-coloured weevils might be a little bit deeper. The vine weevil will quite happily feed on mature leaves and young leaves as well. And the clay-coloured weevil in raspberry crops anyway will mostly feed on the younger leaves rather than the older leaves, and they can damage fruit laterals and things like that. Overall, with these species of weevils, and also with the strawberry blossom weevil that we're going to touch on in a minute, more mature plants have a greater chance of shrugging off vine weevil damage, whether that's at the roots or on the leaves. The root damage is obviously probably worst of the two than the leaf damage, although in large amounts or in damaging young fruit laterals and things like that, then obviously that's a large issue. But that's a good rule of thumb. If you've got young plants, that's probably a time where they're going to be quite vulnerable if it's coming in at a time when you're most likely to be seeing these weevils.
Yeah, I've seen them as quite a bad problem in top fruits. I've seen them in apples when, you know, unexpectedly they've come up at night and completely ringed whole branches. And people have told me it's mice and voles and stuff like that, but it's actually clay coloured. And if you look at the base of the tree, or sometimes 5 or 6, and I've had a lot of experience with them getting up in newly planted raspberries and nipping off all the laterals as they grow, and that's again pretty much only clay colour that cause that. So if you do get them, they can be a big problem, and the adults themselves do a lot of damage, and they're really hard to control. The larvae are, they're like pizzas that you can get in with nematode, but the adults difficult.
Which brings us back to, sorry, very quickly, Nick, and then obviously go for it. But it brings us back to that life cycle, and if you can keep on top of them with nematodes, and keep their numbers low, then you've got a better shot of keeping them under wraps. But if they start building up, like Chris says, most of the controls are focused on the larvae. So once you've got large numbers of adults, they can be quite difficult to get rid of. You had a question, Nick, or experience point?
Just have the mic on.
Yes.
Yeah. There are various products on the market, different forms of nematodes. Could you comment on which species are most effective in particular situations?
With the different species, one of the main sort of focuses with them is their temperature that they are active at and their sort of optimum temperature. So one of the, if you agree, Chris, but one of the main kind of focuses when you're selecting your species or what you're going for would be the effective temperature. Because if the effective temperature is too low, then you want to be making sure you've got a species that has a much better target temperature. So that will then the answer to that varies with the year and what the sort of conditions are like out in the crop. Does that sound about right, Chris?
Yeah, sounds about right. I mean, we normally look in the soft fruit with Steinema because it's working. I think it works down below 5, doesn't it, or down to 5, and a lot of the others down below 10. And how you can work out the soil temperatures, and that can be quite complicated. So I tend to pick the ones that go for the lowest temperature. But Pete's probably got more experience of the range of nematodes available. Especially for vine weevil control. I think in the Lipton often they tend to use Steinema.
Yeah, and I've in a number of trials that I've done, I've used Steinema, and they've worked well. And I know that there's a number of different species, and the bacteria that those species produce is different. But I would mostly focus on temperature and what you need to make sure. If you've got soil data loggers, then you might be able to start using different species, but erring on the side of caution with temperature, especially if you're applying a bit later, sort of September, October time, then making sure that temperature right would be very critical.
I must admit, I've never ever seen a comparative trial of the species in any sort of replicated trial that you can have some faith in. I don't know if you have, Peter, but I'm not sure anybody's done that work, but it could be quite interesting. But as a simple sort of man in the field, I tend to go with the Steinema because I know it's going to work even if it gets cold.
Yeah.
The other question I would have would be about application in the soil. Or going back to the species, because if you apply at a low temperature, you're going to expect them to work more slowly anyway, can't you? So it's more difficult to gauge whether they're effective. In the soil, because I know not so many strawberries are growing in the soil anymore, but the pick-your-own people and the blueberries, you do have to have long-term control. Have you got any comment on how to enhance the control in the soil, because it's probably not as easy as it is in growing media?
I always go back to the old pop song, wet, wet, wet. So if you want to be successful with nematodes in the ground, then you want to wait until the crop's been rained on. It's nice and moist. Then if you can, apply them in rain, because it's the dry in the soil that they are very effective in soil, and obviously some really good control. But it's been when the crop's been wet and they've been applied in rain, or between showers. That's my personal experience of them.
If you've got in, say, blueberries in larger pots, obviously if you're applying via dripper, then the drippers will have areas that they wet more effectively. So bear that in mind when you're making applications in much larger pots, to try and just get the best coverage as possible with your drippers. Or if you're using drenches, that might get a more effective, wider coverage within a pot. With watering, you don't want to get to the point where you're overwatering to the point where you're getting runoff outside of the pot, because you'll sluice some of the nematodes out. So you just want to get, as best as possible, a nice damp compost or soil, but without it just sluicing everything through, essentially, if that makes sense.
Is there any indication of whether the choice of species is more important if you're using it in soil?
Not from my experience, but I will make a note to do a little bit of digging on that, Nick, and then we'll get an answer spread out. One of my colleagues, Jude Benison, has been working on vine weevil for a very long time. So I'll just pick her brains and just see if she's got any thoughts on that, because I'm hesitant to sort of speak about it now and get it wrong, essentially. But we can get something put together. I also know another colleague has used wetters in the past to try and facilitate a better coverage within pots of growing media and things like that. So I'll try and dig out a little bit more information on that as well, as to what she's kind of done. But if you can keep the moisture nice and wet, then it's not a something you always need, if that makes sense. And Chris, have you ever used wetters with nematodes?
You use wetters with nematodes now, but I think if that was a very good point about the dripper, and I think if you're doing big parts, then I'll be tempted to actually put them on with a hose.
Yeah. Would you use a silicone wetter rather than the
yeah, probably, but then I've got no experience, so I can't really comment. The other thing, Pete, is what's your experience of controlling adults with night spraying? I know some farms do it.
I mean, at night the adults will be sat on top, so they are quite active. They will typically be sat bold as brass on the tops of leaves, because I've done collections in my local area as well, just trying to find adults. And so in theory, that should work. I have absolutely no personal experience of applying sprays at night. And I mean, putting health and safety hat, it seems a bit riskier. And in theory, you should get good coverage, but I'm hesitant to really kind of push for that, if that makes sense.
I only have one experience of doing that, and that was the first and last. And if you look behind the tractor as you're spraying, you see all the lacewings and other beneficials collapsing into the foliage, because you have to use fairly nasty insecticides for it to be effective on Weevil.
Yeah, I agree. I think it comes under the heading of revenge spray, and it doesn't really do any good. But some farms go on a revenge streak with it.
I think we've gone.
I don't like revenge spraying at all.
Doing that.
No, and nematodes get a really high and effective rate of control when using them. So there's no, I don't see, if you can stay on top of them, I don't see why you would need to. And like Chris says, it does smack of revenge and just trying to do something, but I don't feel like you're going to overall benefit your crop more than you're going to handicap it.
You're doing quite a bit of collateral damage.
Yeah,
I agree. Have you got any faith in this thing about the harder the weevils are, the older they are, if you squeeze them between your finger and thumb? I was thinking if they're quite hard to crush, then they're likely to be laying eggs.
Sounds like
the sort of Chris Creed thing.
I don't know about that. That's the first one. That's the first time I've heard that one. Now, I'm not entirely convinced by it. Just as a gut feeling, it might work, but to be honest, they live for about 2 years, so they're not around for a hugely long time overall to say that they have a single generation sort of yearly. So aging them, I don't know how much benefit will get you either.
I think the overwintered ones are particularly hard. I think you have to run a steamroller over those to crush them, but the newly hatched are really soft.
You might have more experience with dealing with them early season, Chris, than me. I've done trials, and we know that sometimes the trials don't translate as well as we would love them to. So
we have to borrow one of those machines off the pea people and crush a few and see get some proper data.
I can imagine putting a tender in for that kind of research, Chris, and I don't imagine it going down well.
Yeah, okay, it was topical, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, if there's no other sort of personal experiences or thoughts people have, we'll move on to Strawberry Blossom Weevil. So very different to the other two, especially in size and in body shape. Excuse the slightly blurry image. They're actually quite hard to get images of. So they're around 2 to 4 mil in length. So they're a lot smaller, and the snout actually represents quite a large amount of that body length in total. Now, one of the main differences with these little pests is that they will lay eggs in the flower buds. So they don't develop in the soil. They will develop in flowers, mostly strawberry, but they also are prevalent in blackberry and raspberry crops as well. So they'll lay those eggs, and then they move down, partially down the stem, and then they start to sever it, partially sever it or completely sever it using that little nose of theirs. So you lose a piece of fruit, and you also got a habitat for developing weevils. Now, they are quite elusive. You generally only get one generation a year. I know there's some debate about maybe getting a few more than that because they have a very small, sharp window of opportunity where they're around. And they're sort of generally seen May, June time at their sort of height, but they can start to appear earlier in the spring, and you'll start spotting little bits of damage if they're present. And then once they've been in the crop for a little bit, they'll then migrate to overwintering spots quite early in August, where they'll then wait until the following year. Now, obviously, they're quite an issue with them being quite elusive and difficult to spot. And that's the main sort of task and issue that you've got. They can be particularly devastating for, thinking about this, you've got crops of June bearers, especially late planted ones, because the flushes and fruit will start appearing just at the point where these guys, if they're around, will be the most prevalent. So being aware of your crop and aware of the sort of high risk that they can have is quite important with them. Now, detection of these little pests is quite important. Now, the main issue that we've mentioned is this sort of severed or hanging flowers that they've decapitated that you will see, because the flower heads will start to wilt. So they can be quite standout and can be quite obvious when you've seen them. But also other sort of signs of their presence, you'll have little small notches in unfolding leaves, or you can also get little small bite marks or holes in the petals. There are also options for pheromone traps. They are a winged weevil, which is one point I forgot to mention with the others, is that vine weevil are wingless. So they don't fly. So they are entirely dependent on trudging around from crop to crop. Whereas these guys can be very mobile and can move into a crop quite quickly. So using things like pheromone traps with an aggregation pheromone designed for luring in strawberry blossom weevil, it means you've got the best chance of monitoring when they're present the most, or you can fall back on other methods like looking for the notches or the bite marks and the severed heads. Obviously, a pheromone will give you an earlier opportunity and probably a little easier to monitor them overall. But it's mostly just keeping an eye out for those signs. Okay.
I think you'll see those top two pictures and the flower damage. You can go through a whole season and actually see the weevil itself.
Yeah.
And you know, believe you me, this is a bad pest. You can get 60-day crops wiped out with it, completely wiped out. And any late varieties like Malwina or Symphony or Florence, they can be completely cleared with it. So,
yeah,
you know, with 60-day, you don't get a second chance. They won't flower again. With other bearers, you might be able to live with it a bit. They're just nipping off flowers here and there, but not in 60-day. They can go and clear the lot out. So, you know, be aware of this pest. And it is about any day now. I haven't seen any yet, but down in South Wales, I wouldn't be surprised if it's already wreaking havoc.
I know Janet's seen a few in the southeast.
Yeah,
so they are starting to be around.
Some bad news with it.
Yeah, and that unfortunately segues us into control, because we're a little bit at the moment on a crossroads. The main form of control for strawberry blossom weevil was Calypso, quite traditionally. An early application sort of around this time would do very well. Unfortunately, obviously, it's no longer on the market and we can't use it. And there are very few alternatives, and there's no sort of physical biological control option as far as I've been able to find. So there's no sort of introduction of predators that you can do from biological companies. You may have some natural enemies benefiting you, but there's not that much you can influence at this point. So possible options for dealing with them, you've got things like Dasis, but that's it's not more for, it's completely for outdoor crops. I don't think it can be used in protected crops at all. And then you're down to using sort of well-timed sprays of hallmarks. So if you start to see the damage signs, that's the point that you're going to start wanting to consider using it. And Flipper. Now I know Flippers are mixed, got a lot of mixed opinions with people, and there are a lot of considerations that need to be thought of with using it. It does have an emu for use against strawberry blossom weevil. With strawberry blossom weevil being a hard body pest rather than a soft, it's likely to not be as effective as with others. So you're probably going to be using Hallmark as your kind of main option, with Flipper as a backup if it doesn't work as well as you'd like to. So monitoring and keeping an eye out for this pest is of paramount importance. And it may be that over time we end up with a sort of developing situation where other options are available for use that have been approved in soft fruit that may also have a good level of control for strawberry blossom weevil. But at the moment, we're kind of in murky waters where we're trying to work out what the impact on the industry is going to be. And I know that there's been a lot of questions within sort of floating around between my colleagues about strawberry blossom weevil. And it, as Chris said, it can be a very scary pest if it's present on site. If you're one of the ones that don't tend to have it, then that's fantastic. But keeping an eye out for it is very important, and making sure that it doesn't get a foothold or start to build up at your sites if you don't have it would be very, very beneficial.
Yeah, I think it's one of those pests that you've got to consider your options. If you're in a bearer situation, you could put a Hallmark on there and then get wiped out later on with Western flower thrips. So you've just got to be, you've got to make a lot of judgments about that on 60-day. If you start seeing it, then I'll be doing something a bit more positive. But this is probably better topics for a one-to-one discussion, and feel free to come back to either of us and have a word, about how to handle it and how to judge it. But with blossom weevil in everbearers, you probably won't get wiped out, whereas you will with thrips. But in 60-day, you could be wiped out. So this is a bad pest, and it's about now.
Yeah, it's one of the unfortunate issues that's coming very prevalent in the industry that I'm sure you all know about: limited numbers of sprays with limited numbers of chemicals. So you end up having to try and pick the worst of the bunch to deal with. So it's very, very localized and very, very situational about what the best approach is. So giving some specific advice via a group webinar is not the best approach, really. So speaking with somebody that knows your site or knows the pest well is a very, very sort of strong idea, really. Does anyone have any sort of personal experiences with these this particular pest, or any sort of experience that they've dealt with, or any questions, I guess?
What about you, Nick, and your everbearers? Do you take it as a given, or do you how do you deal with it?
Well, actually, in fairness, the last couple of years we haven't seen it. The worst problem we had was the replant of the first crop of June bearers. Then it was an issue, but that was before we used very much biological control. I think just having the option of spraying with Hallmark is not good, is it? That's really, I think it needs to be rectified fairly pronto. But we did. There were occasions in the field where we had quite serious damage, but not a wipeout. But I hate to think what we sprayed in those days to get rid of the problem.
Yeah,
certainly didn't.
Back in the day, it used to be chlorpyrifos, didn't it?
And
it can come in at any time. It's a question of monitoring, isn't it? You just have to have regular monitoring of vulnerable crops.
Yeah. I'm going to move on quickly to another couple of species. Now, they're just single slides apiece, and they're species that I have very little personal experience with, but speaking with my colleagues, they situationally may appear. So just knowing maybe what to look like, or that these aren't one of the other three that we've been going through, may be helpful. So I thought I'd just run quickly through them. So you've got...
Hang on a minute, Pete. We've got Andy Matthews on this call. So Andy's got some experience of strawberries in tabletops and 60-day. I'd be interested to see what Andy's experience growing strawberries in Brecon with the blossom weevil. If you unmute or get on, Andy.
Yes, I just unmuted now. Sorry, a bit late joining. Yeah, I'm actually down the field now. I've joined a bit late because we're trying to get pumpkins in. I'm looking through hours now. We have in the past suffered badly with blossom weevil, and I just have a peep down the tunnels now to see how we're faring this year, because there's a lot less than I've seen some years. We're very late. The crop's very late, and we're very late covering the crop. due to the high winds and the weather we had a few weeks ago. So I'm looking through now. I can see a little bit of a small amount of blossom weevil damage, but nothing like we've had other years. Don't know why that is, whether the season's affected it. But it's one of the things I was going to catch up with you later today about, to be honest, Chris, and ask what your views were, because it's not looking too bad. I've got quite a few aphids here, but the blossom weevil, like I say, have been a bad pest here in the past, and we always use Calypso at bed burst, and that sort of takes it out. But obviously that's not available now. So yeah,
I think this is one of the
I was going to have the conversation with you, really, see what you thought.
Yeah, I'll have a chat later, but I think this is one of the things about, me and Peter said that we're talking to a wide audience here. We're also talking pan whales, so relatively high up in Brecon is going to be a lot different to Manavir or Anglesey. So we do need to spread this out a bit, really. But if I had some strawberries flowering now, I'd be in them every day just to check, because they seem to just come in on one day to me.
Yeah, but there's very light damage at the moment, but it's something to keep an eye on, because we've had, they can be devastating, absolutely devastating. We're in prime time for it now, like you said, and we'll monitor it. So basically, we've only got the option of one hallmark, have we? If that's not that that's an ideal option, I know, but
not ideal option, no. But it's great to have somebody who's actually in a crop and discussing it sort of in real time. So that's good. Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. It's a good comment.
No problems.
Okay,
Yeah, that's
Pete,
really
sorry,
helpful.
interrupted you there, mate.
No, not a problem. It's really useful, and it's good to get more input, especially from directly in the field. So yeah, I'll just cover a couple of quick points about these other species, and then there's a few sort of general summary points at the end that we go through, and then we can sort of just have another chat and discussion between people if there's any sort of final points that we can think of. So this was another species that was mentioned to me by another colleague, Janet Allen. Now, this is going to be much more rarer or localized than the other species, which you're probably going to find in some way or another at other places. And they're the green nettle weevil, Fallobius, Pomaceus. Now, they're smaller, they're metallic green. Now, from information that I've been able to find, I've never physically seen this pest myself, but they are typically seen more on nettle foliage during April and May. I've just got my notes from when I was having a conversation with her. But they do have males and females, so they breed a little bit more conventionally. And they're very distinctive in the fact that they've got that very sort of metallic green or blue coloration to them. But what she's noted in her experience is that they can appear in a very short burst, sort of similar to what Chris has said about strawberry blossom weevil. They can appear very quickly, and they do cause sort of notching and other damage similar to the other species, but then they'll disappear just as quickly. But they are active during the day, so you may have a better chance of seeing them. So if you aren't seeing them, then you probably don't have them. But it's just something to consider if you ever see a metallic sort of green or blue one, that it's probably.
I go along with Janet. You sometimes see a million of them that come in on one day.
Yeah.
I always call them grass weevils, so I know they got on nettles, but I thought they lived in grass roots, but I might be wrong. But they can do a lot of damage, especially in top fruit. So if you get them in apples, they can bite off a lot of flowers and do all sorts of damage on emerging flower clusters. So
yeah,
I don't fear them, but I think going back to Andy, Andy's seen a fair few of these, haven't you, Andy, over the years?
You're muted, Andy.
There we are. I'll get the hang of it in a minute. Yeah, I've seen them about. It's hard to say how much damage they've. I'm not an expert on these things, but I've certainly seen them in the area. Yeah, that's for sure.
They used to be easily killed with Calypso, of course, back in the day, but no longer, sadly. But that's what we're living with these days.
Yeah. And speaking about the name, the green nettle weevil, Chris, it may well be. And I mean, there's different common names for many different species, but this is the one I found when looking up the scientific name. So I'm a little out of my comfort zone with this one. So if there are,
I might have made that up, grass weevil, but that's what I've always called it.
yeah. Right. And then there's another species, which is the strawberry root weevil. And again, can be a little bit more localized or a bit rarer, but they tend to feed on the root hairs, and they lack those little orange tufts that were on the wing case of the main vine weevil. And so they affect young or new plants the most, mostly because of that root feeding action. And they can also be in raspberries as well as strawberries. I don't know if people have had any experience with these little suckers, whether people have seen them at all, or whether they're just a little bit more elusive or not as common. Chris, have you ever had anything with them?
I don't know, but if I saw that, I'd think it was a vine weevil, just a different breed of it.
That may be part of the battle there. But I imagine I would be surprised if the means of control have varied at all with this one compared to the others anyway. And
Yeah,
the larvae are in the growing media as well. So
these on root hairs quite interesting, isn't it?
yeah. So rounding things.
Feeder.
Sorry. So just rounding things off a little bit. Obviously, Nick, you mentioned that it'd be really good if there was some kind of solution on the horizon, especially for strawberry blossom weevil and things like that. Unfortunately, I've not, from what I've been able to find much in the way of sort of signs of a chemical solution on the horizon for most of these pests. My colleague Janet Allen sort of said that in her experience, by chemical companies, they are considered minor pests, and that the damage caused, although prolific and a massive issue for individual growers, to the chemical manufacturers is still considered very low. So the cost of them creating or getting the applications through for different products is very, very expensive, and they are unlikely to see a return on investment. Doesn't mean that we won't get existing products moved across from different areas or used for different things, but we need to be sort of trying to come up with ways to make it work with the sort of limited tool set that we have at the moment as best as possible. Just being realistic there. I may be wrong, and I'd love to be wrong, that there's going to be some kind of product that's going to come out and solve the problem, but I just don't see it happening within a short span of time, unfortunately. Keeping sites clean as best as possible, again, similar with a number of other pests, is a very useful way of reducing habitat. And with the sort of life cycles that these pests have, if you can break in and generally sort of hammer them well enough so that you don't have a problem every time, then that's your best shot at keeping long-term control. And it should probably be considered more a focus on long-term rather than short-term, because as we've discussed with a number of different people, means of getting rid of adults with a number of these species of weevil is very difficult. So your main focus is quite often on the larvae, apart from strawberry blossom weevil. Okay. Any further sort of general points, Chris?
No, I think it's been a good session, and thanks to the participation, because you know, we learn a lot more about these pests from field experience of them over Wales in general, and I think it's been a very, very useful session, and you know, just the idea of these things is very, very helpful to me.
Yeah, I've got a couple of resources as well for people, similar to with the aphid presentation. One of them's the same, so if you did see that. Now, the HDB does have quite a range of fact sheets with weevil pests. So biocontrol in soft fruit, that's typically more for applying your general biocontrols. You've got a host plant range of white vine weevil, which also goes into what Chris mentioned about preference to plant species. So you've got different weeds and different plants that they like, and that gives you a bit of an idea about what those are. And then you've got fact sheets on beetle and weevil pests in cane fruit, or vine weevil, a specific one for vine weevil control in soft fruit. And there's that the report for that HNS little and often kind of method. But if it's quite a tome, as with many HDB reports. So if people want to approach us for a bit more of a one-to-one, then we can do that as well, for sort of how to maybe instigate that. And And the other one is, I'm chucking this in again in case people didn't make the aphid presentation, but it's the side effect manual that BioBest put out, which can be very useful for working out side effects on different beneficial organisms. I know Warwick University has published something similar, but I believe that's more focused on field veg and natural enemies. And that's looking at different actives, but that's well worth checking out as well. I just thought about that as I was bringing this slide up. So there is another manual that's out and about, so it's worth checking that out as well. If you're trying to balance sort of chemical applications with biologicals. And so, yeah, thank you very much for joining, everybody. I know it's a really busy time.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Peter and Chris, for such a fantastic webinar and a great presentation. And thank you all for joining us. You'll notice I've put the link to the survey, and we'd be really grateful if you could complete that for us. And we'll hopefully see you on the next session. Thanks ever so much.